The stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral is cold against the knees, but the sweat on your brow is hot. It is December 29th, 1170. The air is thick, choking on the scent of beeswax candles and the metallic tang of fear. Outside, the winter wind howls, but inside, a different storm has broken. 4 knights, their armor clanking like the bells of hell, stride through the transept. They are not here to pray. They are here to kill. The Archbishop, Thomas Becket, stands by a pillar, defiant in his vestments. There is a shout, a demand for submission to the king, followed by the terrible sound of steel leaving a scabbard. The first blow shears off the crown of the Archbishop's head. The sword shatters on the pavement. Blood and brains spill onto the holy stones, staining the white altar cloth in a gruesome red map of the violence to come. This was not just a murder. It was a message. It was the screaming birth cry of a dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years, a family who claimed descent from the devil himself and who seemed determined to prove it with every drop of blood they spilled. They were builders of empires and destroyers of men. They were the Plantagenets. If you are ready to walk the halls of power where the mortar is mixed with blood, join us on this journey into the past. Subscribe and witness the rise and fall of the Ruthless. They said the family line began with a scream. Legend whispered that the Counts of Anjou, the forefathers of the Plantagenets, were descended from a woman who was not entirely human. The story was told in hushed tones by the firesides of medieval France, a tale of a mysterious countess who was beautiful, silent, and terrified of holy water. When her husband finally forced her to attend Mass, at the moment the host was raised, she didn't kneel. Instead, she shrieked, burst into flames, and flew out the church window, dragging 2 of her children with her into the sky, never to be seen again. It was a myth, of course. But years later, when the Plantagenet kings were burning villages and slaughtering their own kin, the people would nod knowingly and say, "From the devil they came, and to the devil they will return." If the devil had a favorite son on earth in the year 1154, it was undoubtedly Henry II. He was the first Plantagenet king of England, and he hit the island like a thunderclap. Henry was not a man who sat on a throne. He was a force of nature, wrapped in a cloak of coarse wool. Contemporary chroniclers describe a man who was incapable of stillness. He stood during councils, he ate while walking, and he rode his horses until they collapsed dead beneath him, only to mount a fresh one and keep riding. He had a chest like a barrel, arms like a blacksmith, and a temper that could curdle milk. When his anger flared, he would throw himself onto the floor, thrashing and chewing the straw matting like a rabid dog. This was the energy required to forge the Angevin Empire. We often think of kings ruling a single country, but Henry saw map lines as suggestions, not borders. Through inheritance, marriage, and sheer intimidation, he stitched together a dominion that stretched from the rain-swept moors of the Scottish border down to the sun-baked Pyrenees in Spain. He ruled more of France than the French king did. It was a leviathan of a realm, held together not by bureaucracy, but by the terrifying speed of the king himself. He moved his court so fast that his courtiers begged God for rest, their horses bleeding, their food spoiling in the wagons, just trying to keep pace with a monarch who seemed to be everywhere at once. But a man with such a voracious appetite for power needed a partner who could match his ferocity, and he found her in Eleanor of Aquitaine. If Henry was the hammer, Eleanor was the iron. She was the wealthiest woman in Europe, the former Queen of France, and a political genius who had ridden on crusade to the Holy Land.
Their union was not a romance, it was a merger of two superpowers. It was said that their union was the eagle marrying the lion. In the early years, their passion was as consuming as their ambition. They built palaces, they reformed laws, and they birthed a dynasty. Yet in the DNA of the Plantagenets, power always curdled into poison. The tragedy of Henry II was not that he lacked heirs, but that he had too many. He fathered 4 sons who survived to adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. These were not dutiful princes waiting for their turn. They were wolves, raised by 2 apex predators, and they were hungry. Henry loved his children, but he refused to give them what they craved most: real power. He gave them titles, crowns, and lands, but he kept the purse strings and the armies for himself. He created a nursery of kings, but treated them like children. The atmosphere in the royal court began to shift. The air grew heavy with whispers. Eleanor, estranged from her husband by his constant infidelities and his refusal to share authority, began to turn her gaze toward her sons. She saw their frustration. She saw the weapons they could become. In the torch-lit halls of Poitiers, far from Henry's prying eyes, she began to cultivate their resentment, watering the seeds of treason with promises of glory. The devil's brood was about to live up to its name. The greatest threat to the most powerful king in Christendom was not a foreign army, it was the family dinner table.
The explosion came in 1173. It was a betrayal so absolute it felt mythical, like a reenactment of Greek tragedy on the muddy fields of medieval Europe. Young Henry, the heir to the throne, handsome, popular, and utterly entitled, fled his father's court in the dead of night. He didn't ride alone. He rode straight into the arms of the King of France, his father's mortal enemy. Within weeks, his brothers Richard and Geoffrey joined him. The shocking news raced across the Channel to the king. His sons were not just disobeying him, they were raising armies to kill him. But the knife twisted deeper. When Henry looked for the architect of this treason, he didn't find a foreign general. He found his wife. Eleanor had been caught riding toward the rebel lines dressed in men's clothing, a desperate disguise for a queen orchestrating the downfall of her husband. Henry's reaction was cold and swift. He captured her and locked her away. For the next 16 years, the most vibrant woman in Europe would be a prisoner in her own castles, a ghost moving behind high walls, while her husband fought the fires she had helped light. The Great Revolt was a civil war that set the horizon aglow from the Midlands of England to the coasts of Normandy. It was a conflict fought in the mud and the rain, a grinding campaign of sieges and skirmishes. But Henry II was a man possessed. He moved his troops with that terrifying, supernatural speed, appearing where his enemies least expected him. He smashed the rebel armies one by one. Yet even as he won the battles, he was losing his soul. The shadow of Thomas Becket, the murdered archbishop, still hung over him. In a moment of calculated theater and genuine desperation, Henry walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, the sharp stones cutting his feet. He knelt at the tomb of the man his knights had butchered, stripped off his fine shirt, and allowed the monks to whip his naked back. Blood for blood, a king humbled to save his crown. It worked. The rebellion collapsed. The sons were forced to kneel in the dirt and beg forgiveness. Henry, ever the pragmatist, gave them the kiss of peace, but he never offered them his trust again. The dinner table was now a battlefield where the weapons were silence and suspicion. Peace in the Plantagenet house was merely a pause between storms. The tragedy of the devil's brood was that they could neither live with each other nor without each other. 10 years later, the cycle of violence spun up again.
This time it ended not in a treaty, but in a deathbed. Henry the young king, the golden boy who had started it all, contracted dysentery while campaigning against his father in France. The disease stripped away his beauty and his arrogance, leaving a frightened young man dying in a peasant's hut near Limoges. As the end approached, guilt seized him. He sent a messenger to his father, begging him to come to offer one last forgiveness. King Henry II listened to the message in his camp, his face a mask of conflict. He loved his son, but he remembered the traps, the lies, and the armies raised against him. He feared it was a ruse, an ambush waiting to spring. He refused to go. Instead, he took a ring of sapphire and gold from his finger and handed it to the messenger. "Take this to him," he said, his voice cracking. "Tell him he has my mercy." The messenger rode hard, but death rode faster. When he arrived, the young king was already in his final agonies. In a fit of dramatic remorse, the prince had ordered his servants to drag him from his bed and lay him naked on a bed of ash and sackcloth on the floor, a symbol of a sinner's repentance. There, amidst the grey dust, clutching his father's ring, the heir to England died. When the news reached Henry II, the old lion collapsed. He fainted 3 times. When he finally awoke, he wept with a sound that frightened his generals. "He cost me much," Henry whispered, staring into the nothingness, "but I wish he had lived to cost me more." It was a rare glimpse of humanity in a heart hardening into stone. But grief does not stop politics. With the young king dead, the line of succession shifted. The crown now hung over the head of the next son, Richard, and Richard was not like his brother. He wasn't a boy playing at war. He was war incarnate. Richard was everything the medieval world thought a king should be, tall, golden-haired, and lethal with a sword, but he possessed a coldness that his brother lacked. While the young king wanted admiration, Richard wanted dominance. And standing between Richard and his inheritance was the aging, stubborn figure of his father. Enter Philip II of France. If the Plantagenets were lions, Philip was a viper. He was young, frail, and physically unimposing, but his mind was a labyrinth of schemes. He saw the cracks in the English royal family and drove a wedge straight through them. He whispered into Richard's ear that Henry intended to disinherit him, that the crown was going to the youngest son, John, Henry's favorite, the one boy who had never rebelled. Paranoia, the family heirloom of the Plantagenets, took root.
The breaking point came in the blistering summer of 1189. At a peace conference meant to reconcile the family, Richard did the unthinkable. In front of the gathered nobility of Europe, he drew his sword, not against an enemy, but in defiance of his father. He knelt before Philip of France and offered him homage for the continental lands, publicly stripping Henry of his authority. The old king, stunned and humiliated, watched his empire crumble in real time. War was no longer a threat, it was a verdict. What followed was a pitiful hunt. Henry II, the man who had once ridden across nations without tiring, was now old, feverish, and broken. He was chased from city to city by the combined armies of his son and the French king. He retreated to his birthplace, Le Mans, but even that sanctuary was denied to him. As the enemy approached, the city caught fire. Henry was forced to flee for his life, looking back from a ridge to see the town he loved engulfed in flames. Tears streaming down his soot-stained face, he looked up at the sky and screamed a curse at the Almighty. "God, since you have taken from me the city I loved most on earth, I will take from you the thing you love most in me, my heart." He dragged himself to Chinon Castle, the great fortress in the Loire Valley. The summer heat was oppressive, heavy with the scent of dying crops. Henry collapsed into a fever. He could no longer stand. The end of the greatest empire builder of the age was taking place in a stifling, dim room, accompanied only by the ragged breathing of a dying man. His enemies had won. They forced him to sign a humiliating peace treaty, stripping him of his powers and acknowledging Richard as the sole master. But Henry had one question left. He asked for the list of names, the barons who had secretly sworn allegiance to Richard and betrayed him. He needed to know who had stabbed him in the back. The chancellor brought the scroll. He hesitated, his face pale. "Read it," the king rasped. "Sire," the chancellor whispered, "may Jesus help me. The first name on this list is Count John, your son." The silence that followed was louder than the siege engines outside. John, the baby of the family, the one Henry had doted on, the one he had protected, the one he had alienated Richard to save. John had betrayed him too. He turned his face to the wall. The fight drained out of him like water from a cracked jar. "Enough. Let the rest go. I care no longer for myself nor for the world." He died 2 days later, muttering about shame. But the indignity of the Plantagenets did not end with death. The moment the king's breath stopped, his servants, men who had bowed to him for decades, descended like vultures. They stripped the rings from his fingers. They tore the fine tunics from his body. They stole the furniture, the goblets, even the bedsheets. When the knights finally entered the room to prepare the body, they found Henry II, the Lord of England, Ireland, Normandy, and Aquitaine, lying naked on the cold stone floor, covered only by a short borrowed cloak that barely reached his knees. It was the final brutal lesson of the dynasty. Without power, a man is nothing but meat. The next day, Richard came to view the body. Legend says that when the son approached the father he had hunted to death, the corpse's nose began to bleed, a superstitious sign accusing the murderer in the room. Richard stared at the face of the man who had made him, felt a flicker of emotion, and then turned away. The old lion was dead. The young lion had the crown. But lurking in the shadows, watching with hungry, calculating eyes, was the brother who had betrayed them both. History remembers him as Lionheart, a name that evokes golden armor and chivalric virtue. But Richard I was not a king of England. He was a tourist in his own realm. He spent a total of 6 months on English soil during his 10-year reign. To Richard, England was not a home, it was a bank vault, a cold, rainy island that existed solely to fund his wars. "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer," he once joked. The Londoners didn't laugh. Richard's gaze was fixed east, toward the burning sands of the Holy Land. The Third Crusade was the ultimate stage for his ego. He wanted to be the new Achilles, battling the legendary Saladin for the soul of Jerusalem. And for a while he was. The chroniclers tell of his prowess at the Battle of Arsuf, where he rode along the Saracen lines like a harvesting machine, his sword arm rising and falling until the ground was carpeted with the dead. He was a terrifying, magnificent figure, a man who lived for the adrenaline of the charge. But while Richard was playing the hero in the desert, a creeping rot was spreading back home. He had left England in the hands of regents, but the real power vacuum was being filled by his brother, John. John was the runt of the litter, short, slightly chubby, and plagued by a deep, festering insecurity. He had been nicknamed John Lackland by his father because there was no land left to give him. While Richard was the warrior, John was the watcher. He had grown up in the shadows of his brother's glory, nursing grudges like pets. Now, with Richard thousands of miles away, fighting heatstroke and dysentery, John saw his chance. He began to build his own court, surrounding himself with mercenaries and sycophants, testing the boundaries of treason. The news of Richard's capture on his return journey, kidnapped by a rival duke and held for a king's ransom, was greeted with public shock and private jubilation by John. He immediately tried to seize the throne, spreading lies that Richard was dead. But the Lionheart was harder to kill than that. His formidable mother, Eleanor, now in her 70s, but still the Iron Matriarch, scraped every penny from the kingdom to buy her favorite son's freedom. Taxes were levied on everything, even the gold chalices in the churches were melted down. When Richard finally returned in 1194, the rebellion evaporated. John, realizing the game was up, crawled to his brother. Richard, in a moment of dismissive arrogance that defined their relationship, lifted his brother from the dirt. "Think no more of it, John," he said, patting his cheek. "You are only a child who has had evil counselors." John was 27 years old. The humiliation burned hotter than any punishment. He would never forget it. 5 years later, luck finally broke John's way. Richard, fighting a meaningless skirmish over a pot of Roman gold found in a peasant's field in France, was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound turned gangrenous. As the infection spread, the Lionheart accepted his fate with the stoicism of a soldier. He died as he lived, violently and pointlessly. The crown passed to John, and the darkness that had been gathering at the edges of the kingdom finally rushed in to fill the center. King John was a different kind of monster than his father or brother. Henry II was wrathful, Richard was indifferent, but John was cruel. It was a petty, calculating cruelty that took pleasure in the suffering of others. He was a man who didn't just want to win, he wanted to humiliate. He was paranoid, seeing treachery in every shadow, and his reign became a psychological horror story for the English aristocracy. The defining moment of his tyranny wasn't a battle, it was a disappearance. Arthur of Brittany was John's nephew, a teenager with a rival claim to the throne that many believed was stronger than John's. In 1203, Arthur was captured by John's forces. He was taken to the dungeon of Rouen Castle, and he was never seen again. Rumors swirled through the courts of Europe like toxic fog. Some said John had ordered him blinded and castrated. Others whispered darker truths. The most persistent story was that late one night, drunk and raging, John had gone to the dungeon himself. He had killed the boy with his own hands, tied a heavy stone to the body, and rowed out into the Seine to dump the corpse into the black water. The murder of a family member was a taboo that even the ruthless Plantagenets held sacred. By breaking it, John didn't just become a kinslayer, he became a pariah. His cruelty wasn't reserved for rivals, it bled into his governance. He used the law as a weapon of extortion. If a baron displeased him, John would crush him with fines, seize his lands, or worse. The case of William de Braose is the nightmare that kept medieval England awake at night. De Braose was a powerful lord, a former friend of John's who fell out of favor. When he fled to Ireland, John turned his vengeance on the family left behind. He captured de Braose's wife, Matilda, and their eldest son. He didn't execute them, that would have been too quick. He ordered them locked in a dungeon at Corfe Castle. The door was sealed. No food was sent in, no water. 11 days later, the guards opened the cell. They found the son dead, seated against the wall. Matilda was found dead beside him. In her final, maddening hunger, she had leaned over and gnawed the flesh from her own son's cheeks. This was the reality of John's rule. It wasn't just bad governance, it was sadism. The barons of England, men who were hardened warriors themselves, looked at their king and saw something that terrified them, a man with no moral bottom. While John was terrorizing his own subjects, he was losing his empire. The Plantagenet dominion that his father had stitched together was tearing apart at the seams. In France, King Philip II, the same man who had outwitted Richard, was now dismantling John piece by piece. John's military campaigns were a series of expensive disasters.
He would raise a massive army, tax his people into poverty to pay for it, sail to France, and then retreat before a decisive battle could be fought. The whispers behind his back grew louder. They stopped calling him Lackland. Now they called him Soft Sword. By 1204, the unthinkable happened. Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the dynasty, the jewel in the crown, fell to the French. For the first time since 1066, the King of England was just that, a king of an island, cut off from the continent. The loss was a humiliation that gnawed at John's vitals. He became desperate to reclaim his lands, and desperation makes a king dangerous. He squeezed England until it bled, inventing new taxes, selling widows to the highest bidders, and seizing estates on whims. The barons had had enough. In 1215, the simmering resentment boiled over into open rebellion. But this was not a chaotic riot, it was an organized rejection of tyranny. The great families of England, men who commanded private armies, formally renounced their allegiance to the king. They marched on London, and the city threw open its gates to welcome them. John, holed up in Windsor Castle, looked out at a country that had turned against him. He had no allies left. He had to talk.
The meeting took place on June 15, 1215, in a marshy meadow by the River Thames called Runnymede. History books often paint this as a noble signing of a constitution, a triumph of liberty. The reality was a tense, sweaty standoff between a cornered psychopath and a group of armed thugs. The air was thick with the smell of horse manure and the buzzing of summer flies. John sat in his tent, his face a mask of forced civility, while the barons dictated terms that stripped him of his absolute power. They forced him to affix his great seal to a document, the Magna Carta. It was a long, rambling list of demands, ranging from the profound, the right to a fair trial, to the petty, the removal of fish weirs in the Thames. John signed it, smiling through his teeth. But the moment the barons left, he threw himself onto the floor in one of his father's trademarked rages, gnawing on sticks and screaming that he had been made a slave. He had no intention of keeping his word. He sent a secret message to the Pope, begging for the charter to be annulled. The Pope obliged, declaring the Magna Carta shameful, demeaning, illegal, and unjust. War was back on, and this time it was a fight to the death. John unleashed hell on his own kingdom. He brought in foreign mercenaries, brutal men from Flanders and Poitou who cared nothing for English laws, and let them loose on the countryside. They burned farms, tortured priests for their silver, and turned the north of England into a wasteland. The war centered on the great fortress of Rochester Castle, held by the rebels. John arrived to lay siege. It was here that the soft sword showed he could be hard enough when he wanted to be. The castle walls were too thick to batter down, so John ordered his engineers to dig a mine beneath the corner tower. But he didn't use timber to prop up the tunnel. He sent a chilling order to the local sheriff. Send us with all speed 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating. The pigs were not for the army. They were slaughtered, their carcasses packed into the mine tunnel and set on fire. The rendering fat created an inferno so intense that it burned through the wooden props. The tunnel collapsed, and the massive stone tower above it crumbled into the dust. It was a stroke of gruesome ingenuity. John stormed the breach, and though he eventually took the castle, the rebellion did not die. The end for King John came not in glory, but in mud. In October 1216, while crossing the Wash, a treacherous tidal estuary in East Anglia, his baggage train was caught by the rising tide. John watched from the safety of the shore as his wagons were swallowed by the gray, swirling waters. The crown jewels, the royal treasury, the gold plate, everything was lost to the sea. The shock broke him. He contracted dysentery, likely exacerbated by a gluttonous binge of peaches and cider.
He was carried to Newark Castle on a litter, his body failing, his bowels turning to water. Outside, a storm raged, a fitting accompaniment for the death of a man who had been a tempest to his people. He died on October 19th, 1216. He left behind a country in flames, a French army invading London, and a 9-year-old son named Henry. The Plantagenet Dynasty should have ended there, drowned in the blood and bile of John's reign. But the boy king was about to be saved by the very symbol his father had tried to destroy, the crown itself. The storm that King John left behind eventually blew itself out, but it took a lifetime to clear the wreckage. His son, Henry III, was a man who seemed to have been dropped into the wrong century. He was pious, artistic, and gentle, a builder of cathedrals, not empires. He spent 56 years on the throne, obsessing over the construction of Westminster Abbey, turning it into a jewel box of stone and glass. But the English barons did not want a jeweler, they wanted a jailer. They walked all over him. The kingdom slid back into civil war, and for a terrifying moment it looked as if the monarchy itself might be extinguished by a charismatic rebel named Simon de Montfort. But from the loins of this soft, saintly king sprang a creature of pure iron. Edward I was everything his father was not. Where Henry was short and drooping, Edward was a giant, standing a head taller than any man in his court. They called him Longshanks for his immense height and long, powerful legs. He had a drooping eyelid, a genetic quirk inherited from his father, but when he was angry, the resemblance vanished. His temper was a cold, white terror. It is recorded that once, during an argument over taxes, a dean of St. Paul's Cathedral entered the room to remonstrate with the king. Edward looked at him with such intense, paralyzing fury that the dean collapsed on the spot and died of a heart attack. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply scared the man to death. When Edward returned from the Crusades in 1274 to take his crown, the atmosphere in England shifted instantly. The air grew colder. The chaos of the baronial wars was replaced by a terrifying order. Edward believed in the law, but only as a tool of the crown. He was a legalist tyrant, a man who would read the fine print of a treaty while sharpening his sword. He didn't just want to rule England, he wanted to master the entire island of Britain.
His first target was the rugged, mist-shrouded mountains of Wales. The Welsh princes had long been a thorn in the side of English kings, using guerrilla tactics to bleed invading armies in the deep valleys. Edward did not play their game. He didn't just send an army, he sent an industry. He mobilized the entire workforce of England, ditch diggers, masons, carpenters, smiths. He cut roads through the ancient forests, stripping away the cover that the Welsh archers relied on. And then he built. Edward's campaign in Wales was a masterpiece of architectural oppression. He constructed an iron ring of castles, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, Carnarvon, that remain some of the most intimidating structures ever built by human hands. These were not mere forts, they were statements of permanent dominance. Carnarvon was designed with patterned stonework to echo the walls of Constantinople, a psychological message that Edward was an imperial emperor, not just a king. The Welsh were not just defeated, they were suffocated. Edward appropriated their history, stealing their holy relics and even the crown of King Arthur, melting them down or locking them away in London. To seal his conquest, he engaged in a piece of political theater that bordered on the cruel. He promised the Welsh nobility a prince who was born in Wales and spoke no word of English. He then presented them with his own infant son, born just days before at Carnarvon Castle. The baby couldn't speak English. He couldn't speak at all. The Welsh had been tricked by a dad joke, backed up by 10,000 soldiers. With Wales crushed under his heel, Edward turned his gaze north. Scotland was a different beast entirely, a sovereign kingdom with its own ancient lineage. For years, relations had been peaceful, but in 1286, a stormy night and a reckless horse ride changed history. Alexander III, the King of Scots, fell from a cliff in the dark while riding to visit his wife. He left no surviving children, only a 3-year-old granddaughter known as the Maid of Norway. When she died a few years later during a sea voyage, the Scottish royal line was extinguished. Scotland was decapitated. 13 noblemen stepped forward to claim the throne. Civil war loomed. In their desperation, the guardians of Scotland made a fatal error. They invited Edward I of England to arbitrate the dispute. They thought they were inviting a wise neighbor to act as a referee. They didn't realize they were inviting a wolf into the sheepfold. Edward arrived at the border not with a team of lawyers, but with a massive army. He demanded that before he made any decision, the Scots must acknowledge him as their Lord Paramount. The Scots were stunned. They had no king to lead them, no army mobilized to fight. They swallowed their pride and bowed. Edward chose a puppet king, John Balliol, a man so weak he was known as Tomb Tabard, empty coat. But Edward was not content with being a feudal overlord. He wanted to humiliate. He treated John like a naughty schoolboy, summoning him to London to answer petty lawsuits. When the Scots finally snapped and forged an alliance with France, Edward smiled. It was the excuse he had been waiting for. The legal pretense was over. The hammer was about to fall. In 1296, the English army crossed the River Tweed. The target was Berwick-upon-Tweed, the busiest, wealthiest merchant port in Scotland. It was a city of trade, not war, bustling with ships from Flanders and the Hanseatic League. The citizens, perhaps naive to the nature of the man approaching their gates, mocked Edward from the walls. They made up bawdy rhymes about his long legs. It was the last mistake they ever made. Edward did not order a siege. He ordered an extermination. His knights stormed the low wooden palisades, and the killing began. It was systematic and industrial. The order was given to spare no one. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The chroniclers write that the slaughter went on for days, that the streets ran with blood so deep it could turn a mill wheel. 7,500 people were butchered in the sack of Berwick. The great trading city was turned into a ghost town, repopulated later by English merchants. It was a message written in red ink. Resistance means death. The rest of the campaign was a procession of terror. The Scottish army collapsed at the Battle of Dunbar. Edward marched through the country, stripping it of its dignity. He marched to Scone Abbey, the sacred heart of Scottish kingship, and stole the Stone of Destiny, the ancient rock upon which every Scottish monarch had been crowned for centuries. He carted it back to London and shoved it under his own throne, literally sitting on Scotland's history. But Edward made a classic tyrant's error. He confused submission with loyalty. He thought that by cutting off the head of the snake, imprisoning the nobles, he had killed the body. He didn't see the grass roots. He didn't see the angry young men in the forests. He didn't see William Wallace. The uprising of 1297 was a shock to the English system. At Stirling Bridge, the confident English army, led by arrogant commanders who thought they were dealing with a rabble, walked into a trap. Wallace caught them crossing a narrow wooden bridge. He waited until half the army was across, then attacked. The English were pinned against the river loop, unable to maneuver. It was a slaughter. The heavy knights drowned in their armor. The infantry were cut to pieces. The skin of the English treasurer, Hugh de Cressenger, was flayed from his body and used to make belts for the victors. When the news reached Edward, he was in Flanders. His rage was volcanic. He returned to England, raised the largest army the kingdom had ever seen, and marched north again. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, he faced Wallace personally. The Scots had formed schiltrons, immovable hedgehogs of long spears. Cavalry could not break them. But Edward was an innovator as well as a tyrant. He brought something new to the battlefield, the longbow. He ordered his archers to rain death onto the static Scottish formations. The arrows fell like hail, punching through mail and leather. Gaps opened in the spear walls. Then, and only then, did Edward unleash his cavalry. The Scottish army was annihilated. Wallace escaped, hunted for years like a wild animal, until his betrayal and gruesome execution in London. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts sent to the four corners of the kingdom as a grim warning. But the fire he lit wouldn't go out. A new leader, Robert the Bruce, rose from the ashes. The end of Edward's life was a study in obsession. He was an old man now, sick and dying. His legs, once so powerful, could no longer support him, but his hatred for the Scots kept him alive. He insisted on being carried north in a litter, leading one last campaign against the Bruce. He was literally dragging his dying body toward the enemy. He died at Burgh by Sands, just south of the Scottish border, in July 1307. He was within sight of the country he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy, but he could go no further. His final instructions to his son were chilling. He ordered that his flesh be boiled from his bones, and his skeleton carried at the head of the army every time they marched against Scotland. He wanted to lead the charge even from beyond the grave. His son, Edward II, ignored the request. He buried his father in Westminster Abbey. The tomb is a simple, unadorned slab of gray marble. It has no effigy, no gold, no angels. It bears only a simple Latin inscription, added years later, that sums up the man and the terror he inspired. Edwardus Scotorum malleus hic est. Here is Edward I, hammer of the Scots. The hammer was gone, but the anvil remained, and the man who picked up the crown was made of much softer metal. The crown of England was too heavy for a neck bent by pleasure. Edward II was a tragedy of genetics. He had his father's height and his grandfather's good looks, but he possessed the soul of a dilettante. In an age that demanded a warrior king, Edward preferred to dig ditches, thatch roofs, and swim in the river with the common folk. He had no interest in the grim business of war or the boring mechanics of state. He was a man who wanted to be loved, not feared. And in the shark tank of the Plantagenet court, that was a death sentence. The king's heart did not belong to his kingdom, nor to his wife, the beautiful Isabella of France. It belonged to Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon knight, witty, arrogant, and flamboyant. He treated the ancient earls of England with open contempt, coining insulting nicknames for them. He called the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Ardennes. The nobility watched in horror as at the coronation the king ignored his new queen to fawn over his favorite, draping Gaveston in royal purple and jewels meant for the monarch. The relationship was a poison in the veins of the realm. It wasn't just the scandal, it was the access. To get to the king, you had to go through Gaveston. The jealousy of the barons sharpened into murderous intent. The black dog of Warwick eventually bit back. In 1312, the barons captured Gaveston. They dragged him out to a lonely road in Warwickshire. There was no trial. 2 Welshmen ran him through with swords, and the brother of the king was left to rot in the grass. Edward did not seek justice, he sought revenge. He spent the next decade stewing in bitterness, eventually finding a new favorite, Hugh Despenser, a man even more rapacious and cruel than Gaveston. Together they unleashed a reign of terror, executing rebels and seizing estates. But in his blindness, Edward forgot the one person he should have feared most, his wife. Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Fair of France, the Iron King. She had steel in her blood.
For years she had endured the humiliation of her husband's lovers, the loss of her lands, and the removal of her children. But her patience was not infinite, it was strategic. In 1325, she seized a chance to return to France on a diplomatic mission. Once she crossed the English Channel, she refused to return. In Paris, she began to dress in the black of a widow, declaring that her marriage was dead. She formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English lord who had escaped from the Tower of London. They became lovers, united by a singular ambition to destroy the king. They gathered an army of mercenaries, and in 1326 they invaded. It was less a war than a collapse. Edward II found himself alone. His allies deserted him, the cities closed their gates. The king and Despencer fled west, hunted like foxes. They were captured in South Wales, huddled in the rain. Despencer was given a traitor's death, hanged, drawn, and quartered, his genitals cut off and burned before his dying eyes.
Edward II was dragged to Berkeley Castle. He was no longer a king, he was a liability. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. But as long as the old king breathed, he was a threat. Plots to rescue him began to surface. Mortimer and Isabella knew that a deposed king is a dangerous thing to keep alive. The night of September 21, 1327, remains one of the darkest stains on the English monarchy. The official story was that Edward died of natural causes, but the screams heard from the castle told a different tale. Shrieks so loud they were heard in the village outside the walls, waking people from their sleep to pray for the soul departing in torment. The chroniclers, perhaps projecting the judgment of the age onto the method of execution, recorded a gruesome end. They wrote that to kill the king without leaving a mark on his body, his captors held him down, inserted a horn into his rectum, and thrust a red-hot iron spit deep into his bowels. He was burned from the inside out. It was a horrific, symbolic punishment for the vice that had defined his reign. The Plantagenets had murdered their own before, but never with such intimate, grotesque cruelty. The king was dead. The queen and her lover ruled, but they had made a miscalculation. They had underestimated the boy who now sat on the throne. Edward III was 15 years old, but he had watched the carnage of his family with wide, observant eyes. He had the blood of the hammer in him. He waited, he watched, and when he turned 18, he struck. In October 1330, the court was staying at Nottingham Castle. It was a fortress locked down by Mortimer's paranoia. He knew he had enemies, but he didn't know the layout of the castle as well as the locals did. In the dead of night, young King Edward III and a small band of trusted companions entered a secret tunnel cut into the rock beneath the castle walls. They crept through the darkness, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the muffled beat of their own hearts. They burst into the royal apartments, swords drawn. The scene was chaos. Mortimer was seized in the Queen's chamber. Isabella, seeing her lover dragged away by her son's men, fell to her knees, weeping. "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer," she cried. But Edward III had no pity. He had learned from the best. Mortimer was hauled to Tyburn in London and hanged as a common criminal. Isabella was spared execution, but was stripped of her power and wealth, forced to live out her days in comfortable, irrelevant confinement. The puppet strings were cut. The Lion of England was awake. Edward III was the perfect synthesis of his ancestors. He had the charm of Henry II, the warrior spirit of Richard I, and the ruthless efficiency of Edward I. But he had something they didn't, a unity of purpose with his people. He healed the rifts with the barons by giving them what they wanted most, war.
Not a civil war, but a glorious, profitable war against the ancient enemy, France. In 1337, Edward declared himself the rightful king of France, igniting the conflict we now call the 100 Years' War. It was an audacious claim, backed by a terrifying new military reality. The Plantagenet war machine had evolved. The knights were no longer the undisputed masters of the battlefield. The power had shifted to the yeoman, the peasant with a yew-bow. The test came on August 26, 1346, near the village of Crusades. The French army was massive, a glittering tide of Europe's finest chivalry, confident in their numbers and their armor. The English were tired, hungry, and cornered. Edward III took up a position on a ridge and waited. As the French attacked, the sky turned black, not just with storm clouds, but with arrows. The English longbowmen didn't aim at individual targets. They filled the air with a rhythmic, lethal rain. The sound was described as the buzzing of 1,000,000 angry bees. The French charge was broken before it could even reach the lines. Horses went mad, trampling their riders. Knights knocked into the mud were helpless as turtles on their backs. It was then that the English infantry moved in with long knives. They didn't take prisoners. They slid blades through visors and into the armpits of the fallen nobility. It was a slaughter of the aristocracy by the working class. In the thick of the fighting was the king's 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, dressed in black armor. He fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. When a messenger begged the king to send reinforcements to help the prince, Edward III refused. He said, "Let the boy win his spurs." And he did. He became the Black Prince, the most feared warrior in Christendom, a wraith who would haunt the French imagination for a generation. But just as the Plantagenets reached this zenith of glory, a shadow fell across the world. It arrived on a Genoese trading ship in 1348. It was invisible, silent, and unstoppable. The Black Death. It was an apocalypse that made the brutality of kings look like child's play. The pestilence didn't care about lineage or borders. It started with a headache, then a fever, then the black swellings in the groin and armpits, the buboes. Death followed within days. The smell of rotting bodies hung over London like a fog. The graveyards were full, so they dug mass pits, layering bodies like lasagna, a layer of dirt, a layer of corpses.
The Chronicle of the Monk of Rochester captures the sheer existential horror. There was no one who did not fear that the end of the world had come. Half the population of England died. Villages were left entirely empty, the church bells silent, the cattle wandering aimlessly in the fields. Yet the ruthlessness of the Plantagenet state was immune to even the plague. The war did not stop. It merely paused to catch its breath. Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers, a law forcing the surviving peasants to work for pre-plague wages, crushing their hopes of a better life. The machine had to keep turning. By 1356, the Black Prince was back in France, raiding and burning. At the Battle of Poitiers, he pulled off the impossible again. Outnumbered, he not only defeated the French army, but captured the French king, John II. It was the moment of supreme triumph. The King of France was a prisoner in the Tower of London. The Plantagenets held the ransom of a kingdom in their hands. They were the masters of Western Europe, their courts dripping with gold and looted tapestries. But the wheel of fortune, so beloved by medieval writers, was beginning to turn. The tragedy of Edward III's reign was that he lived too long. The glorious young warrior became a senile old man, controlled by his greedy mistress Alice Perrers, who allegedly stole the rings from his fingers as he lay dying. And the Black Prince, the hope of the dynasty, the man who was supposed to be the greatest king of them all, began to rot from the inside.
He contracted a wasting disease in Spain, dysentery or dropsy. He bloated, grew weak, and finally died in 1776, 1 year before his father. The heir to the throne was no longer a battle-hardened hero. It was the Black Prince's son, a 10-year-old boy named Richard. A boy who had known only luxury, who had never seen the blood of a battlefield, and who believed that kingship was a divine right, not a job that required a sword. The stage was set for the final act. The hollow crown was waiting. The end of the Plantagenet Dynasty did not come with the roar of a cannon or the charge of 1,000 knights. It began with the courage of a boy, and it ended with the silence of a ghost. In 1381, London was burning. The peasants' revolt had engulfed the capital. Thousands of angry commoners, pushed to the brink by poll taxes and the plague, had marched on the city. They beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury and stuck his head on a pike on London Bridge. The nobility was paralyzed with terror. They looked to the Tower of London for leadership, but they didn't find a warrior king. They found Richard II, a 10-year-old boy of just 14. But Richard had the blood of the Black Prince in his veins. In a moment of breathtaking bravery, the boy king rode out to meet the mob at Smithfield. When the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was struck down in a scuffle, the peasants drew their bows. A massacre seemed inevitable. Richard spurred his horse forward, riding alone toward the nocked arrows. "Sirs, would you shoot your king?" he shouted. "I will be your captain. Follow me." The mob, stunned by his golden presence and his divine confidence, lowered their weapons. They followed him. He had saved the city. He had saved the crown. It was the high watermark of his reign. But as the peasants dispersed, expecting the freedom they had been promised, the other side of the Plantagenet nature revealed itself. The mercy was a lie. The retribution was swift. "Serfs you are," Richard told them later, "and serfs you will remain." The boy who had played the hero was already learning how to play the tyrant. As Richard grew into a man, it became clear he was a different breed of Plantagenet. His grandfather, Edward III, had been a man of oak and iron. Richard was a man of velvet and silk. He hated war. He ended the fighting in France, a move that disgusted his nobility, who thrived on plunder. Instead of battlefields, Richard built a court of unparalleled luxury. He invented the handkerchief. He encouraged the fashion of shoes with points so long they had to be chained to the knees. He demanded that he be addressed as Your Majesty or Your Highness, elevating the king from a leader of men to a semi-divine being. This was not just vanity, it was a political philosophy. He believed in the absolute, unquestionable divinity of his position. He commissioned the Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece where he is depicted receiving the banner of England from the Virgin Mary herself. In his mind, he was not answerable to Parliament, or to the law, or to the barons. He was answerable only to God. The atmosphere at court became suffocating. It is recorded that Richard would sit on his throne for hours in silence, watching the courtiers. If his gaze fell on a man, that man had to drop to his knees immediately. To look the king in the eye was an offense. He surrounded himself with sycophants and new men, alienating the old, powerful families of England, the very men who commanded the private armies that kept a medieval king in power. Paranoia, the old family curse, began to gnaw at him. He remembered the fate of his great-grandfather Edward II. He struck first. In 1397, he unleashed a purge of his enemies, the Lords Appellates. Some were executed, others were murdered in prison. He seized their lands and used the money to fund his private army of archers from Cheshire, men who wore his badge of the White Hart and terrorized the citizens of London.
But Richard made one fatal mistake. He targeted his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke was the son of John of Gaunt, the wealthiest and most powerful duke in the land. He was a warrior, a crusader, and everything Richard was not. The tension between the two cousins came to a head in 1398. They were scheduled to resolve a dispute by trial by combat. A massive crowd gathered at Coventry to watch the duel. Just as the lances were lowered, Richard threw down his baton, stopping the fight. He exiled Bolingbroke for 10 years. It seemed like a masterstroke. He had removed his greatest rival without shedding blood. But when John of Gaunt died the following year, Richard's greed overtook his judgment. He extended Bolingbroke's exile to life and seized the vast Lancastrian estates for himself. He had broken the fundamental rule of feudalism. Property is sacred. Every baron in England looked at the seizure of the Lancastrian inheritance and thought, if he can do that to the most powerful family in England, what will he do to me? Richard felt secure. He was so confident that he took his army to Ireland to put down a rebellion. He left the back door of England wide open, and in July 1399, Henry Bolingbroke walked right through it. Bolingbroke landed at Ravenspur, a port on the Yorkshire coast that has since been swallowed by the sea, a fitting starting point for a ghost story. He came with a small force, claiming he sought only the restoration of his inheritance. "I come but for my own," he told the northern lords, but as he marched south, the lie evaporated. The great families of England, the Percys and the Nevilles, flocked to his banner. They brought their armies. The trickle became a flood. When Richard landed in Wales, returning from Ireland, the news hit him like a physical blow. The kingdom had already fallen. His general, the Duke of Albemarle, deserted him. His household knights slipped away in the night. The King of England, who had believed he was God's anointed, found himself wandering the Welsh hills with a handful of terrified servants, stealing food to survive. The trap closed at Flint Castle. It was August 1399. Richard stood on the ramparts, looking down into the courtyard. Below him was a sea of steel, Bolingbroke's army. There was no escape. The king descended the stone stairs, his long velvet robes dragging in the dust. He met his cousin in the courtyard. Bolingbroke knelt, but the gesture was a mockery. "Your Majesty," Bolingbroke said, "I have returned before my time because the common people complain that you have ruled them harshly. With God's help, I shall help you govern better." Richard looked at the man who held his life in his hands. His response was quiet, resigned. "Fair cousin, if it pleases you, it pleases us." They took him to London, not as a king, but as a prize. The crowds that had once cheered him now threw rubbish and cursed his name. He was locked in the Tower of London, the same fortress where he had once huddled as a frightened boy during the Peasants' Revolt. On September 29, Richard signed the instrument of abdication. He took the ring from his finger, the signet of his power, and placed it on Bolingbroke's hand. He was stripped of his titles, his dignity, and his name. He was no longer Richard II. He was just Richard of Bordeaux. Parliament accepted the resignation. Henry Bolingbroke John, King Henry IV, the Plantagenet line had not just been broken, it had been hijacked. But a living ex-king is a dangerous thing. As long as Richard breathed, he was a rallying point for rebellion. In January 1400, a plot to assassinate Henry and restore Richard was uncovered. The Epiphany Rising failed, but it sealed Richard's fate. Henry IV could not afford mercy. Richard was moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, a fortress known for its cold dungeons and thick walls. He was placed in a tower room, and there the darkness descended. We will never know the exact moment of his death. The most persistent and chilling theory is that he was not stabbed or poisoned. That would leave marks. Instead, he was simply forgotten. The orders were given to cease all food and water.
Imagine the horror of those final days. The king who had invented the handkerchief, who had dined on the finest meats in Europe off silver plates, was left to gnaw on the straw of his mattress. The cold of the Yorkshire winter seeped into the stone. The silence was absolute. Slowly, painfully, the life withered out of him. On or around February 14th, 1400, the last of the main Plantagenet line died of starvation, a hollow shell of a man, consumed by the emptiness he had created. His body was brought to London and displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral. His face was left exposed, a final indignity to prove to the doubters that the king was truly dead. The stone floor of Canterbury is silent now. The blood of Thomas Becket has long since been scrubbed away. The castles of Edward I in Wales are ruins, their roofless halls open to the sky. The arrowheads of Crecy are rusted into the French soil. For over 300 years, the Plantagenets held the world by the throat. From the demon countess who flew out the window to the starved king in the dark tower, they were a dynasty of extremes. They were the architects of England, forging a nation through law and language, but they mortared the foundations with bones.
They were the lions who ate their own young. They proved that the distance between the throne and the dungeon is measured only in inches. And as Henry IV lowered the crown onto his head, he didn't realize that he hadn't ended the violence, he had only changed the players. The devil's brood was gone, but the bloodletting was far from over. The War of the Roses was coming. The Plantagenets taught us a lesson that echoes through the corridors of history. Power is not a possession to be held, it is a beast to be ridden. And sooner or later, the beast always throws the rider.